Can you hear me okay?
Definitely so.
So this is the second talk I gave about an hour and a half ago. I gave one on certain principles, solubility, kinetics, relating them to separation, not necessarily chromatography, but also to things related to product formulation, loss, which may interest you, loss, COA analysis, where does CBD go in a packaging environment where the CBDA would prefer to be in the packaging material and not in the matrix. So I first started in chromatography just historically, and particularly the area of supercritical fluid chromatography in 1968 at the University of Utah. So it's kind of really living with the escape. And I got absorbed in the cannabis space quite early at the age, and I'm still actively in it. And one of the areas because of chromatography background and the privy to consult and with is the chromatography. And this is a bit of a difficult task because basically you would have a whole short course in chromatography trying to relate particularly to scale up in production, which is sort of the focus of this talk. So what I tried to do is select things from my common everyday experience in consulting and R&D. Hopefully, where we're trying to make the most out of our formulations and material by applying chromatography. So let's get on with it here. So my objective is to sort of discuss the role of chromatography in cannabis science and technology, and what are some of the minor cannabinoids of interest. Certainly they're in the expo, delta-8, CBG, etc., and how they might arise, because I think it would be bad. Oh, the mic isn't on this one. Hello?
I think that's working.
And what can analytical scale chromatography teach us in the possibility of the scaling up? For instance, the COA type analysis, which is done by the analytical vendor laboratories, is there useful information there or not? The importance of mobile and stationary phase selectivity, I'm going to emphasize throughout this because it's a cost factor when you scale up. What you can do on an analytical scale with bonded silica phases, say HPLC, are not as easily transferable to scale up without considering the economies of scale. And ultimately, talk about some of the existing formats for doing preparative and production scale chromatography. Also, of course, my little favorite niche, the role of supercritical fluid chromatography, because it's a more green technology. And also, just a little bit about non-chromatographic methods for possibly that might be applicable to particularly these minor cannabinoids that are becoming prevalent interest. And then a little bit about future analytical requirements. I worked a lot at one point in my career, still in a way do, in regulatory chemistry. And I think there's going to be a wave that's coming along. And it's going to be in areas besides just potency analysis and volatiles, headspace analysis, etc. So I'll briefly mention that. And then some final thoughts to summarize it. So the extract, the role of chromatography in cannabis processing, it's usually more.
I'm going to see if I can get that to work for you.
More of a tail end process for high purity purification of particularly, but not always, a single cannabinoid moiety. And this schematic, I did some consulting with a prominent Canadian company called Metapharma Labs in Barrie, Ontario. And this is borrowed from their website here, but they primarily are into supercritical CO2 extraction because it gives them a wide range in their formulation without having to worry about solvent residuals, etc. And some of these I think you're familiar with, so I won't take up a lot of time from the point where you do the crude extraction the best you can to maybe get 35 to 40% of your target cannabinoid or cannabinoids. And then you use the vacuum or molecular distillation to further enrich it, along with some dewaxing, usually with cryogenic ethanol is a favorite. Now, so chromatography, and I'll put an animation there, comes in. They have it listed as centrifuge chromatography. That's in relation to their, at that time, their interest in CPC, which I'll talk about, centrifugal partition chromatography. They lost interest in it because it involved essentially organic solvents, usually a hydrocarbon solvent, maybe an alcohol, but things that then were disposal issues, or they had to recover that or do something with it. But the main take-home message is that chromatography plays in here at the end of the process. And the relevance here with delta 8, delta 10, CBG, CBN, this and that is how it might be applied in as high a resolution, particularly on a production scale, we can realize to get these moieties enriched and captured for commercial utilization. So very quickly, as I mentioned, the supercritical chromatography uses the same as the SFE, which is carbon dioxide as the main fluid for cost reasons and the fact that its critical temperature, either sub or supercritical, is about 31 degrees centigrade, so it isn't a heat-intensive process, which can convert these cannabinoids and result in loss of terpenes also. But it anchors one on the left-hand side of a number of green pressurized fluid solvents. The other, which I've had very extensive experience in, is called subcritical water. And that may be a new thing to you. It's not supercritical water, which is used to destroy hazardous waste. Supercritical water could be used to, remove or create the waste biomass from the cannabis processing or hemp processing. You could convert it into a fuel source or maybe extract something else of value. But I worked in conjunction with my work in CO2 at the USDA lab in Peoria on hot water extraction. And subcritical water, I don't want to get into this, that's an individual lecture, is usually done depending on what you want to do with it, whether you want to extract or you want to have it as a reactive media, like depolymerization of lignin or depolymerization of biomass that has sugars that can be converted to ethanol. But a lot of our work has been done with berries and extracting anthocyanins from grape pomace waste. And in a way, it's kind of interesting because all your colorful names, purple kush, and some of the strains of marijuana have these flavonoid, flavone type compounds in them. And there are a lot of people who think there may be some economic value into isolating them too. And then you have the intermediate thing of adding ethanol, generally regarded as safe solvent or grass solvent on the CO2 side. It has a certain finite solubility, about 20 mole%. And then on the water side, the historic hydroethanolic solution is used. In some of my consulting work back in time and so forth, people wanted to get rid of pure ethanol extraction because of its regulatory thing, the IRS having to keep mass balance and all those concerns. So down there, I've got a little insert about matching fluids with the properties of the solutes, meaning cannabinoids or terpenes or whatever found in hemp. And the lecture I gave about an hour and a half ago dealt with something called solubility parameter theory, like dissolves like, rationalizing things that happen in the cannabis hemp processing and formulation area. And I think that'll be available as a video stream later after the conference. So basically the question is, this is a preferred medium here, could be exploited even greater in the hemp and cannabis processing area. So I thought I might say something about minor cannabinoids. The panel chaired by my friend John McKay, we got into this a little bit and I talked a little bit about this. Some of these are slides from Dr. Williams' presentation at Cayman Chemicals. They make a whole array of high purity standards. They're kind of a Chicago-based company. So I asked him if I could borrow a few and he was okay with it. So these are sort of an array of our minor cannabinoids, not all of them, but you can see the CBD and THCs and their acid analogs. And then you have the delta 9, which I'll show you how it usually results, either purposely or non-purposely. The delta 10, the CBN, which is usually an oxidative degradation product of THC. Metapharma Labs in Barrie, Ontario, routinely grab samples from the freezer of high strain THC and monitor it for, possible conversion to CBN. And you can see other ones there also. So the cannabinoid biosynthesis is well known. It involves synthase, enzymatic conversions. Eventually, it'll lead us down to things like CBDA, or cannabinoid acid, which I think many of you are familiar with. But more importantly is once you get it into the acid form or you get it into the neutral form, like delta-9 THC, how do you, convert it into delta-H THC? And we have a lot of examples of samples available in the expo on this. And, is this of concern or is this really what you want to do in this case? And so this involves acidic conditions. I might comment in passing that I see a lot of bath bombs with citric acid in them and CBD. There has been a study done at a Michigan University on various matrices that have citric. A gummy bear would be an example too. And these have the ability to catalyze slowly the THC into these other forms in this case. Keep this in mind. So the isomerization again occurs where acid environments reign, maybe not quite as extreme as HCl or salonic acid. And the delta-8 drives the equilibrium. In other words, it's really the more stable equilibrium form of the material of the two isomers in this case. So the also thing, and one of the reasons I think maybe the interest is in delta-8, is that it's about 50% less effective in terms of its psychoactive, effect, but it still has one. Some of these cannabinoid isomers and derivatives do not have that effect, as you'll see in a minute. So then you have an isomerization around the double bond to delta-9 THC to delta-10 THC. And this frequently occurs under basic type conditions wherever they might exist. And this delta-10 results in essentially two diastereoisomers. The diastereoisomers of delta-10 THC can be fully separable. You'll see some examples of chiral chromatography in a minute. So when I go back almost like the 1970s, and I know some of the people working in the beginnings of chiral chromatography, now this very elegant technique applied in pharma chemistry, is upon us in our cannabis space. And the delta-10 isolation, there have been reports that it creeps up when you do distillations, either ambient or under vacuum, mostly by accident and so forth. And again, at least this is not my area of expertise, delta-10 doesn't show any pharmacological effect as the delta-9 does. And you also have a pathway leading from isomerization of delta-10 THC to another form called delta-6A, 10A, THC. And this again is acidically, characterized, but this is the delta-10 acidification, not the delta-9 in this case. So the progression goes on. And I didn't bother to show slides, but there are a lot of different derivatives that can be derived simply from essentially CBD or delta-9. And this is an isomerization of delta-10 THC to that. This is a stereospecific reaction with the two generated isomers of delta-6A, delta-10A, THC. The enantiomers, again, can be done by chiral, as I've said. I think it's kind of a repeat slide, so I'll move on. So this is an example of a chiral column separating delta-10 THC and the delta-6A, delta-10A THC derivative in this case. And you can see the original chromatogram with a single pretty much peak on at least an analytical or semi-prep scale for the delta-10 material. And then you can see, pretty much a nice conversion into the stereoisomers of the delta-6A, delta-10A moiety 2. Cannabidiol is also another oxidative product of THC. And here you have the THC-AA, the delta 9. And this is where you have the impact of oxygen, or light in this case, to produce a CBD-A intermediate. And then by heating or getting careless with the temperature control, you can create CBN, which I mentioned this Canadian company monitors its presence. So again, using a proper storage headspace like nitrogen, possibly even CO2, can avoid some of this degradation, at least in chemical storage. CBN formation can also occur in the plant with the formation of CBNA or DA, I can't read it from here. Okay. So anyway, that's kind of a primer in how some of these minor cannabinoids occur. So getting back to the chromatography angle, this is one type, and there are many types of COA analysis. I just picked this one because I consulted with a Kentucky hemp company, and they were using ProVerda in Massachusetts. This is very typical. There are all sorts of COAs. Usually they're presented online, or you get a printout, or now they scan them by phone code to get this information. So it's pretty much standard par for the industry in this case. And here you see, at least the way ProVerda displays it, a very high specific strain. Again, I should be looking here at the thing, but I think it's a very high CBDA, if I'm reading that correctly. And so that means it's a non-decarboxylated moiety at this stage. It hasn't been heated purposely or not. So the question, though, in showing this is, can you take some of this data with the analytical type columns that are used in it and transfer it over to scale up? The answer is yes, but usually at a price that's consistent with the stationary phase. And if it's silica, it will be costly because it's probably had surface ligands added, to create its surface activity and hence its separation. There are a lot of things you can do in simple adsorption chromatography, modes called displacement chromatography or frontal chromatography. The cleanup of butane, propane extracts, if you're using hydrocarbon extraction, which brings over a lot of unwanted, particularly colorful moieties and this and that, by simple treatment at the end of your flashing procedure with propane or butane. You can use something like fuller's earth, activated carbon, and come out with a very pure material. In my last lecture, I showed producing THCA diamonds, which precipitate out. And there's a great deal of difference in the clarity of the diamonds. Those that haven't been flushed through activated carbon are color chromophoric. The ones that use the activated carbon are very white and crystalline in this case. So not all modes of chromatography have to be of the level of analytical sophistication to be useful. And this I just show, there are a number of portable instruments. This is probably the most simplest one. Dr. McKay, I know, uses this. This is Lab Light's HPLC portable analyzer. I think analyzes for about 7 things. It involves, I believe I'm correct in this, some kind of ion exchange principle. This happened to be when we were doing some work. It's the basis actually of our Emerald Scientific video series, which are free if you sign up on Emerald Scientific's website. And this is partly from that. And, provides you a field on the spot, even in the laboratory, for THCA, CBD, the acid analogs here, including delta 9 THC and a few others there. But again, the columns that are used for this, scaling them up, you have to be aware of the cost of that. Also, on the mobile phases, if these mobile phases, and this is the advantage of SFC, if you can make it proficient for what you want to do, the use of, aqueous, reverse phase things, even a normal phase approach with a hydrocarbon solvent, you do have the organic solvent, issue to dispose of or rectify somehow. Another area in the analytical field that is worth noting is there are a number of cleanup methods. They frequently referred to as SPE, solid phase extraction. And I was on this lady's master's thesis in chemical engineering, and this is from a journal called the Journal of Supercritical Fluids. And she was able to enrich by CO2 extraction to about a 40–45% level. And what she was trying to do for the forensic authorities in Bogota, Colombia, was to create as high a purity sample as she could, at least in Colombia. And I think she got to about 93–94% purity delta-9 THC. So to do this, she had to couple the SFE and the afforded enrichment there. And then she went into an SPE type cartridge like a C18 or silica and further enriched it to, the low 90% purities in this case. So there's a whole litany of SPE methodologies out there. There are other interesting methods I don't have the time to get into. There's an analytical method called MSD, matrix solid phase dispersion. It's used a lot by pharmaceutical people. And this involves taking, in the case of hemp or cannabis, you would mull, literally mix, with a very cheap adsorbent. Frequently in analytical, it's a diatomaceous earth that's pelletized. And by mixing this, and then doing the chromatography, which is a form of displacement chromatography, you eliminate a lot of interferences in analytical assays. And the reason why I mention it is that's what you want to do in production scale. But that's actually mixing a very cheap sorbent in, usually it's a 60 angstrom silica, and then, migrating out the cannabinoids of interest, be it analytical or possibly in preparative work. And this was just part of the study that Gallo did. She used a typical sort of surface response plot to optimize the conditions in terms of the pressure and temperature on the CO2 to get the most enriched extract she could do before applying the SPE cartridge approach to further purify it. And this brings you into what also is pretty much a generic homologue, if it's the right word, called flash chromatography. Again, typically you're disposing of the cheap adsorbent in this case. This company, which I've done consulting with way back in time, Applied Separations, produces this, and they have some interesting information on their website. The main hook here is that you're using CO2 in the liquid state as the mobile phase. So that, you're not using organic solvents in the issue. So you can see here that also it doesn't require a CO2 pump. They're actually using tank pressures, in this particular case at 80 bar, to do the flash chromatography in this case. So it'd be interesting, they have an integrated photodiode array detection, so you can see the profiles. And all that's dry loaded. It's a basic silica, nothing too expensive. And you can do fraction collection, which is also feasible in semi-preparative chromatography. This I just located the other day. I thought it's interesting. I'm going to tie it in with what's called adsorption isotherms and how they play a role in all this from my own personal experience. But our process is a major instrument provider in the CO2 space, both for extraction, and now they also have a chromatography element. They also bought out some of the Waters lines of equipment well over a decade ago. And this shows us CBN isolation from CBD due to the oxidation effect. And here you see a co-solvent being used as 3% ethanol in carbon dioxide, which at that level of adding CO2 or adding ethanol to CO2, you have a one-phase system. And so you can see the analytical results below, and you can see the preparative results above. And what you see is that the increase in going to a more preparative mode, frequently you get merger of peaks. And one way to avoid impurities is to do peak shaving on either side of the binary peak profile there to get the high purity CBD or CBN. And that also ties in, which I'll show in a minute, to a form of chromatography called simulated moving bed chromatography, SMB. Now, another form of chromatography, and this is speculation a bit, but perhaps someone out there has already done it, is molecular-imprinted polymers. I think they're called MIPs, M-I-P. And here you essentially create a resinous-type polymer, and you clathrate it around the target molecule, like delta-9 THC or delta-10 THC. The question is, you know, with that subtle difference in molecular weight and isomerization configuration, whether you can make a molecularly imprinted polymer specific enough to affect that. There's also a company called 6-Wave in southern Canada who takes a similar approach. And some of the SFA people are going this route with these very specific stereo adsorbents. Sort of akin, if you're familiar with size exclusion chromatography, which I've had a lot of experience with. But the MIP is theoretically possible to make a cavity specific to the delta-9, delta-10, the CBN, and exploit the stereochemistry this way. And Liger is a company I visited when I spent 9 weeks in New Zealand helping with them roll out their hemp processing program. And they were particularly, in this case, interested in applying MIP not with supercritical fluid media, which would be possible by the way these resins swell in CO2, but using it with an ethanol concentrate, essentially to sequester out you know, particular cannabinoids from like an ethanol dewaxing element in this case. And this sort of pie diagram over here and the histogram shows the purification of the CBD in this case from the other type materials using this molecular imprinted polymer approach. And this is a very concentrated hemp sample captured on the MIP type resin, again from an ethanol-based feedstock. So for those of you who might be using ethanol, this might be a route possibly to getting the purification of these so-called minor cannabinoids from ethanol extracts. CPC, centrifugal partition chromatography, takes advantage not just of a phase equilibria, kind of crudely illustrated there for CBD and CBG in this case. And this is really kind of classic partition coefficient chemistry. So you have two immiscible phases. And this sets up the possibility of using an aqueous phase, which limits the solubility in some cases of cannabinoids, certainly, as I said in my lecture earlier today. But also it involves a hydrocarbon water or a polar versus non-polar partition. And then you amplify this separation unit principle by applying a centrifugal force field. And there are several vendors of this. One of them I'll mention is Rotochrome that uses this principle. I do know from, again, doing some consulting that this isn't the favorite son, if you want to use that expression, of some of the cannabis processors because of the organic solvent and contaminated water streams that result from this. But in principle, it can provide separation of these minor type cannabinoids from one another. And they have built these systems. They had a huge one at MJBiz when MJBiz was a virtual conference. They have an active website where you can look at their units. And several companies have CPC units. There's an American, I believe, company out of Bushy, I think have one. There's also another one in England. If you are interested in these vendors of it, I'll be happy to direct you to them. Now, simulated moving bed is a different system, and to get into a schematic of it is a nightmare, so to speak. But what this involves is usually the central feed, frequently of a 2 or 3 component system that you want to separate out the two. And it involves a series of complex time-involved arrangements. This has been scaled in my own experience for high fructose corn syrup, if you're familiar with it from Coca-Cola. They enrich fructose to 55% levels, and they even go to 90% levels too. So when they get the glucose fructose thing, they apply ion exchange chromatography, an aqueous medium, and they use simulated moving bed. And that's how high fructose corn syrup is produced. So this has also been applied in the petroleum industry. And now SMB, and I'll show you an example of one company in Colorado I visited, are also trying to apply SMB. But the major thing about SMB is that you usually are down to a 2-component, 3-component system. Once you get into many more components, it gets very complex. You have a world-class expert in, I believe it's chemical engineering at Purdue, Dr. Wang, who has written a number of articles on this. But primarily, as you can see here, you have a central feed, which the green arrow indicates. And then you have these agglomerate of binary peaks, say, CBD and CBN. And so as they separate on the preferred adsorbent or the preferred stationary phase, you then are taking off the tail continuously. That's one of the benefits of CPC or SMB. And so you're continuously taking off an extract in a sort of a raffinate, and one of them will be component 1 and one of them will be component 2 in this case. And it's a countercurrent operation in principle, but you create what's called a standing wave. And so the equilibrium or the stability of the simulated moving bed requires a lot of technical sophistication, but it is practiced on a large scale, as I just cited for sugar separation. This is an analytical SFC chromatogram of a hemp-based feedstock. And let me say this is analytical SFC. And they were using analytical SFC to monitor an SMB purification. I'll show you what the SMB system, it's a French system, Novacell. So this is a company, I think they've been bought out a few years ago. My contact was Dr. Reed at EBU. They're up around Boulder in the Rocky Mountain Front Range. And here you can see, if you can read the small print, separation of 5 principal cannabinoids. Again, this involves stationary phases that can be a bit on the expensive side. It involves systems that look like this, multiple columns. So what has happening here is you have these valves going in and out, synchronizing to create your standing wave and your 2 components that are separating apart. And usually you're using peak shaving to get the 99.9% of one isomer versus the other. When I was in New Zealand for 9 weeks, I got involved in some preparative supercritical fluid chromatography. This, in a way, connects with cannabinoids, but it also connects with hemp seed oil, which even in our expo out here, you have people selling hemp seed oil. That's the male seed oil with the omega 3 to 6 preferred distribution, 3 to 1. This was a home-built system. You can see the schematic up there. Involved a lot of typical, this was a government research institute. This is binary syringe pump feed. The columns, which you'll see an example of, were in a water bath. I think, there it is, yeah. So it was a pretty crude system, but it can be made a lot more sophisticated. One of the problems, I don't know what your experience has been here in the USA, Canada, or wherever, is that sometimes to do analytical work with regulations and paranoia, it's very, very difficult to work with materials to develop, particularly on a process scale. We could not even move our standards, from one lab to another. You had to do work in a lab that was specified. They also were kept in a wall safe. So there's all this hubris that you have to deal with. So we worked around it by getting semi-purified samples that indicates there's CBD, CBG, CBC, and some mixtures of them. Also CBD, 99% isodiol, cannabinoid was used, a CBG, and then we made mixtures up to prove, chromatographically we could separate them in the composition stated in the last billet there. In this case, the stationary phase was fairly high resolution. 5 micron is pretty small particle size. You can see the conditions, 50 centigrade, pretty modest. Now this was a pure CO2 system, also with some alcoholic co-solvent that proved efficient, the ethanol once again. So we use typical low wavelength monitoring. I might make a comment, a lot of the PAD or standard wavelength detectors at say 220, they can pick up a lot of material. There are a lot of chromophores that show up at that wavelength. So the idea that that wavelength is specific just to THC or CBD, that's not quite true. And without doing like a PDA, what do they call it, adsorbents ratioing analysis, you could have a buried interference or contaminant under what you're assuming is a CBD pure or THC pure peak. So anyway, these are the conditions the colleague used here. We looked at an array of columns. These were from a particular vendor, ES Industries in New Jersey. The ligand, the nitro, the aminophenyl, ethylpyridine, for example. These were groups functionalized on the silica. You can see we ran on lateral pressures from 100 to 280 bar, sort of matrix the flow rate and the percentage of ethanol to get sort of the best optimization we could. Keep in mind the silicas are expensive on scale up. So hopefully you can see the color code. Here we have a CBD separation from CBG. And the color code indicates a function of pressure there, monitoring at 220 nanometer. And as you go up in pressure, you get, less retention. What's called the K prime factor is reduced. You can also suffer a loss in resolution. Now, at this scale of analytical chromatography, everything worked fine, but I'm going to point out in another chromatogram what lies in the horizon. These have tailing peaks, and these are called essentially a Langmuir isotherm. So it's not a fronting peak, and the shape of these peaks as you scale up and put more on the columns plays a key role in how effective you can do preparative for even production scale chromatography. Here's pure silica, probably the cheapest versus the bonded type phases at 250 bar, 40 centigrade stated flow rate, and also the addition of a very small amount of ethanol. Keep in mind ethanol is grass. There are a number of separations that use methanol, and that's fine for analytical work. The problem gets to be if you're going to scale this up, methanol is a toxic solvent. You have to consider the impact on your process. So maybe it's difficult to see the color code, but the same thing, is affected by increasing the pressure, a reduction in retention time, more throughput possibly there, but also a loss in RS, the resolution factor between, in this case, the CBD and the CBG moieties. And here again, it's just silica, again at the stated conditions with CBD and CBG. But the point in showing you this chromatogram as a function of pressure is notice in the blue case, which is, I believe, the lowest pressure, the CBG peak is fronting. It's not symmetrical. So as you get this and you start putting more concentrated solutions of CBD and CBG on here, that's going to essentially come together with the CBD peak. And this is where hopefully simulated moving bed, comes to your rescue because you're going to peak shave on the other side of the CBD. Ideally, what you would like to have is, a correspondence, so to speak, between the adsorption isotherms. They're not linear as they are in analytical chromatography. We get nice symmetrical peaks, but that doesn't always work out in real life. Just a comment, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. On the hemp seed oil, one of the questions that arose, by the way, in New Zealand, they use hemp seed oil as actually in salads. It's kind of a bitter oil, but it has this nutritional value ratio of omega-3 to 6. And some of the people here actually on the expo are selling things, integrating it in with cannabinoid compositions or formulations. So Canada, or New Zealand at the time, was importing all of their hemp seed oil from the prairie provinces of Canada because it had been outlawed. And one of the questions that came up is, does it have any appreciable content of THC or cannabinoids? So we did a little study. I want to go through it very quickly on this. And we got 7 or 8 types of seed oils. At least 3 of them were locally grown in New Zealand, which they now have an industry. And they also, the others were from Canada. This is a pure silica-based separation of the major fatty acid triglyceride moieties listed there. And there's a reason for that you'll see in a minute, because we later mixed hemp seed oil with cannabinoid material to see if we could separate out the oily constituents, the fatty acids, and so forth, the triglycerides from the cannabinoids. And this kind of is going to show you this. This is the hemp seed oil in a particular column, a silica-based column, under the stated conditions. You see the profile. We weren't so much concerned with resolving, just isolating quickly the triglyceride components in the seed oil. And then we spiked this with CBD and CBG in this case, and you can see the little peak down around 2 to 4 minutes is the essentially the seed oil, the triglycerides, and it is well separated from the CBD and CBG. I might comment, I made some discussion with somebody here. There are people who will fill an extractor half filled with hemp seed oil, the omega fatty acid moieties, and then they will have the other half filled with, say, a hemp flower or a THC flower. And so they extract both the properties of the delta of the omega fatty acids along with the cannabinoids to get a kind of a enhanced nutraceutical composition. Anyway, we did, as I mentioned, 10 of these. We used a Waters UP squared instrument to look at this analytically. And this is simply the one at Callahan Innovation. It's sort of a government-funded agency. As far as the triglycerides go, when you use the UP squared, they come out as sort of a collage of fatty acid peaks, sort of a humpogram, if you want to call it that. So we were able to use the low-resolution mass spectrometer to separate out the components by specific ion monitoring, in this case. And in the hardware, software that UP Square affords with mass spectrometry linked up, you can do a principal component analysis and therefore differentiate between the various hemp seed oils, whether they do contain any appreciable amount of THC, CBD, or whatever. So that's what we did in this case. This is just another form of this. What you see, though, is differences, and as summarized in the billet statements down here, the SFC-MS system picked up principal peaks that had the stated formula. What we couldn't quite resolve whether this was THCA, the acid analog form of delta-9 THC, or CBDA, but we definitely certified that there are trace levels. So that's kind of interesting because if you go to, let's say, a drugstore where they're selling hemp seed oil, people are thinking they're getting something that's physiologically going to be active. And the truth is, the cannabinoids are there, but they're in ppm type levels in this case, with very little value. And this simply is another expression of the relative cannabinoid content in commercial seed oil. As you can see, it varied, though, even at that low level. And these are just the conclusions. I won't read them billet by billet, but again, confirming that 357.2 M to Z peak was kind of the hang up to differentiate between CBDA and THCA. While we're on this subject, what I think is going to happen in the future, once I know my friends, the FDA can hold this, is if you offer them a product, and some of these products you see in the Expo 4 are aggregates, essential oils, lipid material that may have been due to the processing, not being ultra hot pure isolates or whatever. They're going to want to know what else is in there. And it's going to be a lot of lipid, a lot of carotenoid separations. And there is an article to that effect, and Mace has this extraction magazine. You can probably pick up this copy up. So, you know, it asks, you know, the question, you know, sort of in this particular issue, I don't know whether it's out there now, are minor lipid components going to be assayable in the future? Aside from potency analysis or residual solvents and all the other safety concerns, are they going to be concerned about this other lipid material? And I think the answer is definitely yes. Because you're moving toward pharmaceutical chemistry in this case, away from natural products chemistry. And so they're going to be interested if you have residual wax, if you haven't gotten for cold ethanol precipitation, what wax content is, be anywhere from C42 to C56 moieties. Neat hydrocarbons are not necessarily an emulation of wax-like esters. Of course, the triglycerides, the fatty acid analysis, the pigments, which because of their high molar absorptivities, you know, easily provide color even to a CO2 and, God forbid, an ethanol extract. The anthocyanins I mentioned. In some cases, even with ethanol, you're taking over small amounts of sugar or carbohydrates. That's known fact. So they're going to be interested in anything pertinent to the mass balance analysis of the whole production process. Way back in time, I did what was called capillary SFC. It's not really scalable to a production scale level. But at that level, you can get a very nice, beautiful cosmetic chromatogram of coconut or MCT oil. So this is the kind of thing, this is by 100% CO2 and SFC in this case. The kind of thing that I think, particularly the analytical repertoire of chromatography, you're going to get into this kind of thing. So with that, I've used up, I think, my time. It's late. I'm happy you were able to join me here. Please feel free to contact me at the specifics there if you have some other interest in chromatography. As I say, it was my lifeblood for many years. And I thank you for coming, and hopefully you found my discussion interesting and informative. We used a lot of chromatography at my USDA position in conjunction with CO2, but using very cheap adsorbents to enrich the SFE extract. In fact, we did phospholipid separations very nicely by using cheap adsorbents like alumina and silica. And then with the SFC principle, mobile phase being CO2, we could tweak the density, the pressure and temperature of the CO2. We could add the co-solvent. We actually had an interesting system that would do 24 samples of hemp, not hemp, but this particular botanical matrix overnight. So anyway, I've had a lot of experience in that and trying to carry over some of the experiences into the hemp cannabis space. Thank you. It's been an honor to address you.